Hey, it's Wednesday. Thank you for joining. I will probably put this as a YouTube video when I'm done here. So if you hear ASMR noises in the back, that's me heating up some milk for my coffee and pouring coffee. This is another audio. I do these audios practically on a daily basis on our Book of Hours Facebook page, which is a community page. So we welcome anybody to leave comments as long as they are not abusive. And we welcome any ideas, and we welcome any input. I wanted to go through the beginning, the starting point, so to speak, with Book of Hours. We did a video essay on something called restriction of movement. Well, we called it restriction of movement. I would say that going back a couple of years, I don't want to go too far back, but just going back a few years, maybe back to 2018, which was when we left San Francisco and moved to Pittsburgh. And we bought an old house that's about 100 years old. And we started really reflecting on all the things that we had seen, but we never really had an opportunity to internalize and really focus on. Because living in San Francisco, we were distracted. We were distracted by our fun life. We were distracted by our privilege, and we never really focused on the, sort of the underpinnings which have led us to where we are now. And so I'm going to try to take you through our process and our shadow work and our description of what's going on a microscopic level, like in our little neighborhood, to maybe a global level. I'll try. I'll do my very best. So back a few years ago, we did a video essay called Restriction of Movement. What it did is it talked about the Real ID. The Real ID was going to be an upgrade to our driver's license here in the United States. So it had to be, it was another system of like approval. It was another way to approve your existence. So not only did you have a driver's license, but now you had to have like this extra layer added onto it so that you could be like state approved, and it was called the Real ID. And we did a video essay about it called Restriction of Movement. So we feel that the Real ID, which was first introduced as a concept in 2005, we believe that the Real ID and the rollout of it and everything and the demands that were made on the population was sort of a trial balloon for, compliance and capitulation of the public to follow sort of nonsensical rules which are not based in law. So this was sort of a trial balloon for that, and not enough people capitulated because the reason was because there was no incentive to capitulate. There was no threat. So incentive is the opposite of threat, right? So if you don't do this, then this will get taken away. There was sort of an implied threat. It was a soft threat. Like if you don't upgrade your Real ID, then you don't have a legitimate driver's license or a legitimate identification. So there was this implied threat, but there was no real, there was nothing really to give people that incentive to follow the Real ID. So many people in the United States just simply didn't they didn't get a real ID. They just continued with their driver's license, despite the fact that, leadership, your governors and your municipal leaders and your mayors and even your Department of Transportation would continue to put out literature and, really strongly encourage people to move forward with the real ID. No one really did. I mean, some people did, but not everyone. To us, that was a trial balloon for capitulation. That was a trial balloon for following orders that really didn't incentivize people to follow them or not to follow them. So they fielded this ID. They started doubling, this idea. They started doubling down on this idea after it was originally fielded in 2005. They started doubling down on it and started talking about it more and more in like 2018, I would say, which is when we did our video essay, I believe, 2018. So it's called Restriction of Movement, so you can go back and look at that. And then the next video that we did was called Expulsion. Expulsion was another clue into what we're experiencing today. It was a big clue. It was a huge signal. It was a pivot into this idea that our historical artifacts would be removed from us so that we couldn't remember where we came from, so that we could lose our sense of historical perspective. This story is about how a high school in San Francisco, California, decided to whitewash and paint over or cover up somehow beautiful frescoes that were embedded into the walls of the school itself. The video essay that we did describing this entire situation is called Expulsion, and you can go back and look at it. And this is all pre-COVID stuff that we did. We challenged the idea that murals that depicted how our country was really founded and how our country was really built up, which it was built up on the backs of slaves. We questioned why these frescoes, which were part of the WPA era back in the WPA area, the president had signed into legislation, or he had opened up programs to pay for artists to come in and do things like paint murals and paint frescoes. And frescoes are different than just murals. When you think of a mural, you often think of, something that's just slapped on the side of a wall or the side of a building. A fresco actually takes the plaster, and it takes the JP could describe it much better than I could, and he did describe it very well in the video we did called Expulsion, where it actually takes the material and incorporates the material into the artwork. So the only way that you can actually destroy the artwork is to literally paint it over with white, or to take a bulldozer to it, which is essentially what the school district the board that was fielding this idea to get rid of these frescoes, these nearly 100-year-old frescoes. I think they're probably about 80, 90 years old now, that were painted by Victor Arnautoff when he was commissioned by the arts programs to paint a bunch of frescoes throughout the United States, and the majority of them are on the West Coast, I believe. And he was friends with Frida Kahlo and these kinds of artists. You can go back and watch Expulsion, which goes into great detail about how the artistic representation of our true self and our true history should remain intact so that we never forget where we came from. So we did this, this video essay about it, and it was supported and cheered on by the arts community in San Francisco, specifically the alumni for that particular school, who had, spoken passionately about keeping these frescoes in place. What we saw with this story was a microcosm of what we're probably going to be seeing a lot more of, more and more of throughout the globe. We were told by the media that the children that attended the school in San Francisco where these murals are located, we were told that the children were offended by them because they depicted slavery, and they depicted the true historical context of the founding of our country and the building up of our country, which is that, false treaties were written between the colonizers and the Native American population, and those false treaties ultimately ended up, in the long run, they ended up taking land that didn't belong to the colonizers, and ultimately the Native American population was nearly decimated as a result of false promises, just this overbearance of sort of like, white power that wanted to enslave a population. That is basically the way our country was founded. It was a business deal. The United States was originally an outpost for military dominance. That's how we were founded. So we go into this a little bit in expulsion because we wanted to keep those murals intact so that people could remember the history. But the media said, no, the murals need to come down because they're hurting the feelings of and offending the students that attend the school there. When you would actually talk to the students and they're like, no, they're actually really cool. We're actually really proud of the murals. This goes back to, San Francisco history. People are very proud of San Francisco. Every city is very proud of its unique history. And so what we realized as we took a step back is that all of the unique history that makes each individual community different from the other one is there will be attempts to whitewash it. There will be attempts to do away with it. And you get, a lot of this language of, we have to take down these statues. In some cases, yes, I do believe that statues should be taken down. Some of the statues were put up during the civil rights protests, in the 40s or the 50s or the 60s, and they were cynically put up as a way to cynically give a nod towards the country's history. So it's important that, things like these beautiful frescoes, which were painted into the walls, and the material was actually part of the wall itself and part of the artistic depiction itself, is not the same as a cynically erected statue in the 1950s and 60s to support white supremacy. It's really important to understand the difference between the two, and not a lot of Americans especially really understand that. So please go back and watch Expulsion, which was another pre-COVID video essay that Book of Hours did. Another video essay that we did prior to the age of COVID, which again was a clue, a window into what we're experiencing now, was something called, what is the name of it? It's regarding SB 606, which is the idea that large swathes of land, which belongs to the public, is then privatized. And this was done, this video essay is very short. It was inspired by Naomi Wolf, who came forward with this piece of legislation and shared it on her Facebook page, and we then made a video essay out of it. Theft of the Commons, that's the name of the video essay that we did prior to the age of COVID, called Theft of the Commons, where the commons, the common land, is then taken away from the people through this idea of suspension of rules. This is very, very, very key, or suspension of law. This is very key right here. This was an extreme pivot and a very obvious window into what we are looking into right now, what we are experiencing right now. So what they did is so what happens in this country is when you want to change a street name. Say you want to change the street name to somebody iconic like Martin Luther King Jr. You waive temporarily, you waive laws, or you waive rules for that local community in order to put in place the name of this new street name. Okay, that's a very simple way of describing sort of this idea of suspension of rules. And so what happened with SB 606 is they used that concept, that suspension of rules and suspension of laws, in order to do huge land grabs, tens of thousands of acres of wild open spaces, which are now privatized, and the public no longer has access to them. This is a theft of the common land. That's why we called it Theft of the Commons. So please go back and watch that. It is a window into what we are experiencing now, where your local public accommodation laws are suspended and no longer considered enforceable because they are balanced against your local community's rules. Like, for instance, we have public accommodation laws that are in place that say that you as a business are not allowed to refuse service to anyone despite their disability status, despite the color of their skin, despite their income status. There is and despite their health status, there is nothing that is legal for you to not accommodate the public. So these are called public accommodation laws. They're tied in with civil rights laws. They're tied in with human rights laws. Those public accommodation laws were suspended in the age of COVID, just like we saw that laws which would protect Native American land and protect public land were suspended under SB 606. So it's really important that when your mayor says, hey, look, all of the COVID mask and vaccine passport policies have been reversed, and then he does the little asterisk, the little caveat that says except for schools and except for vulnerable populations like nursing homes. Those two institutions which are supposed to accommodate the public and which are paid for typically by taxpayers are still violating the law that's already in place, which is a public accommodation law. But corporations have decided that they are the business infrastructure of our communities and of our country, have decided that they have more power and that they can override laws that are already in place. So please go and watch something called Theft of the Commons, which is another video essay that we did prior to the age of COVID, which offers a window into what we are experiencing now. So to recap, we did something called Expulsion, which is a story about how George Washington High School wanted to destroy the murals, and the murals were a depiction of our true past. So in the age of COVID, we have that depiction of our true past being erased, not only in a physical way, like from our communities, but also in our minds as well. Who we are as human beings is being erased, especially through the way the children are being taught in school. The children are being taught behavioral programs instead of actual criteria or curriculum that would teach them about the past. And that's why the children are forced to wear masks, and yet you can go out to a restaurant and you don't have to. So please go back and watch Expulsion, go back and watch Theft of the Commons, and go back and watch Restriction of Movement. These are 3 key video essays that we did prior to the age of COVID, which tell a story. And the story basically says something is about to happen. Something is coming. Pay attention to these, little microscopic examples of how your life will be changed under the suspension of what it means to be human, and the suspension of your constitutional protections, and the suspension of public accommodation law. Please go back and watch those 3 video essays through the eyes that you have now, which is that you are seeing truly that in the age of COVID, this is a human rights grab, not necessarily a health crisis. Another video essay that was done just before the national emergency was declared. The national emergency was declared on March 13th of 2020. In January of 2020, I did a video essay called Folie à Deux. And what Folie à Deux is the psychological operation. What Folie à Deux is the psychological operation that we are experiencing right now, where we have a mass psychosis taking place. And in January of 2020, before I even knew that there was even such a thing as a toxin or a virus or whatever, because I don't really pay attention to mainstream at all. I only pay attention to what's happening to society on a micro level. And then the micro can identify the macro, all right? So I wasn't really paying attention to anything that was going on. I don't listen to NPR. I don't read the New York Times. I don't pay attention to CNN. I barely pay attention to what's going on, in the local community here as far as like mainstream. But for some reason, I was inspired to make this video called Folie à Deux, which talks about a shared psychosis among 2 people. And then and I also talked about, in the video Folie à Deux, I bring up something called Folie en masse, which is the mass psychosis. Okay, so the shared delusion among the masses, the shared psychosis among the masses. So let's put all of these video essays together. SB 606, which is Theft of the Commons. Expulsion, which is the micro story about George Washington High School being told that they need to get rid of murals which depict our true past. Restriction of Movement, which is the story of the Real ID and how a new layer of policy or a new layer of obedience was required in order for people to have a legit or legal driver's license, and also Folie à Deux. So those 4 were made prior to the age of COVID. So now what I want to do is move forward into the video essays that we've done, which are now describing where we are in the age of COVID. The first one we did was called Quarantyranny, We knew that it was a financial reset, so to speak. We knew that it was a military operation. We talked about how military tactics are used in order to control a population. We also talked about how it was a psychological, sort of a psychological meltdown through screens, where various messaging would be done through the screens, through your social media, in order to convince a population to do a certain thing. We knew that the shutdown of the cities all throughout the world and all throughout the country were not at all because of a health problem, but because of these, military-like strategies and operations that, that were taking over the population. So then let's move forward to something we call lifelong learning. So lifelong learning came a little bit after quarantine. It took a while to make. We made many of our video essays during lockdown. What you looking for?
I'll find it. Go ahead and continue talking.
We made lifelong learning, which talks about, which explains very clearly why the schools are still requiring the students to wear a mask, even though the city that those schools may occupy are not requiring masks. Let's use Denver, for example. Michael Hancock is the mayor of Denver, and he announced yesterday that the mask policy and the vaccine passport policy will be reversed as of February 4th, which is this Friday. But he follows it up by saying, let's still follow the practices of vulnerable populations. So vulnerable populations, whenever you hear that term, that's code for nursing homes. And he said that schools are still required to wear masks. So a lot of people pushed back and said, well, we don't get it. Why is it that we can go play pool, go eat out at a restaurant, go to a concert even, and go have a life, and we don't have to follow any of these measures, and yet the schools still do? This doesn't even make any sense. Why are you doing this? Especially since children are considered, they're not considered vulnerable to the so-called virus. The problem is that you're using their language to fight their policy. What you have to do is use the real reason why those children are continuing to be masked, even though the city itself has stopped their public health ordinance. It's what's it called when it ends? It's done.
Oh, well, I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So it's over, so the public health ordinance is written by and announced by your local health secretary. And we all had public health ordinances that were announced by our local health secretary of health in all of our communities. This happened. Those ordinances, or those orders, those public health orders to wear a mask or show proof of a vaccine in order to have access to anything at all, were not law. It baffled me and many of you out there why so many citizens and so many people capitulated to something that wasn't even a law. Whether it's damaging to you or not is not the point. The point is that there's nothing to enforce this order. So just because the mayor comes out and says these orders are reversed, well, they were never a law or anything real to begin with. So to reverse them is kind of silly. Like, sure, I mean, it helps. It helps the community, and it helps, people to sort of get back to living a normal life. But there was nothing to really enforce this. I wrote a blog post a while ago about ordinances and what a law really is. And I think all of you would know, but for those people who don't, a law is put into place by your legislative bodies. And so, for instance, in some, let's just use a coastal community, all right? There is a law in place in many coastal communities that says you are not allowed to swim after dark in the ocean. And it's for many reasons. It's for safety. It's because there are no lifeguards on duty to see, and it's unsafe. So the people who are part of the municipal body that is near these coastal regions get together and say, let's take a vote on this law of no swimming after dark. So they get together and they have the yays and the nays, and the yays win. And so they turn it into an ordinance and they give it a number. And then they take that number and they say, by law, based on ordinance number, and then it's usually a string of numbers, you may not swim after dark in the ocean. And if you are caught swimming after dark in the ocean by, say, like a cop or, beach patrol or something, they can cite you with a ticket. And then you would take that ticket and you would go to the court and say, I don't want to pay this. And the judge will then decide if you have violated the law or not, based on information that you provide. Well, I was swimming at 4:30 and it wasn't quite dark yet, but the cop said it is, that kind of thing. And you bring in your thing. Your circumstances about why you don't want to pay the fine attached to the actual ordinance. During the age of COVID, we saw all sorts of signs in the windows of grocery stores and restaurants and cafes. You are not allowed entry without a mask. And yet there was no ordinance number attached to those signs. There was no vote taken to turn that into a law, which meant that you didn't have to really do anything. It was just store policy. And so the goal here is to understand that store policy does not govern you. You are not governed by protecting your community. You are governed by law. You are not governed by rumors. You are not governed by false data. You are not governed by manipulation tactics. You are not governed by feeling guilty. You are governed by law. So this seemed like really logical to me, but unfortunately logic has left the building. So here we are, wondering why the mayor of Denver, which is a very blue city, by the way, because we've noticed that most of these really extraordinarily fascist policies are being implemented in bluer cities like San Francisco, Seattle, Denver, Philadelphia, Boston, cities like that. So we are listening to the mayor and we are saying, yay, you are going to veto, you're going to end, you're going to stop the public health order. That's great. You're signaling out your support of the people. No more masks, no more vaccine passports. That's awesome. Why are we still targeting the schools then? And why are we still targeting the elderly? Well, we are targeting the schools because the school districts are getting paid to create a new, they're getting paid to impact behavior. Now, this is where your psychological operations come into place. Impacting the behavior of a human being is a human rights violation. That goes against,
I know.
God's law, I guess. It goes against the law of being a human being, to impact the behavior of a human being, to force them to change their own will. And so that's what's happening in the schools, is it's much more deadly and much more destructive than the idea of simply putting on a mask. It really is. I don't advocate for masking at all. But I want to pinpoint the real reason why school districts are still forcing a mask on the children. In the future, there will not be the kind of money that we have, I guess you could say, we've enjoyed over the last 100 years or so. The future, there will be less money. There will also not be any social safety nets. Things like, Social Security will go away. Food stamps will go away. Programs that pay for people to, sort of get help through life. All of these federal safety nets, these federal social safety nets, which people depend on, are going to go away.
Well, at least by the federal government.
Right.
They'll get picked up by another entity.
They might get picked up by another entity.
I think that it'll flip into the third sector.
Well, that's where I'm going
right,
with
cool.
this. So what will happen then is these children are being trained to just follow orders, without questioning why they have to put on a mask or why they have to follow orders. Remember how I told you that the 4 video essays we did prior to the age of COVID were a window into what we're experiencing now? Restriction of movement was one video we did. Folie à deux, which means the shared psychosis, is another video we did. Expulsion of your history is another video essay we did. And theft of the commons, which is the theft of the open spaces and the free land and the things that we enjoy. All of that was a window into what we're experiencing now. So what we can see with the mask policy on the children in the school districts is a window into their future. People who wear masks, human beings who wear masks, are slaves. That's what they are. We can see that we are training a generation of slaves. All of those social safety nets that we talked about, which JP just said will be incorporated into the third sector, will be rerouted into their behavior. If you take these classes and go and try to get this job that 1 million other people are trying to get, then you will be awarded your social safety net. Okay?
Oh, and by the way, you'll have to pay for those classes, but we can help you with that. And then you'll continually
and you'll
be in
get
debt.
a loan and be in debt and all that stuff. So let's take the trucker convoy story and let's apply it to what we're talking about. Right now, the trucking industry is one of the highest paid industries, working class industries, left in the United States. And there are digital programs and automation programs in place which are going to replace those high paid jobs. The next generation of children, the ones that are in school right now that we are forcing to wear a mask, they are going to be trained in, robotics, and some of them will, not all of them, but some of them will be trained in these in technologies. So a trucker in the future, whether this happens in the next 5 years or the next 10 years, a trucker will be a person sitting on their laptop, putting in the code and surveilling the automated truck that is a part of the supply chain. That's what trucking will be about in the future. The only way that an individual can have an opportunity to be part of that automated system and get that job is if they have the money to take the programs and they have the backing of the family, like maybe they come from a well-off, family that can put them into these programs so that they can probably end up being one person, check this out, one individual to manage and control and drive, and I put the word drive in quotation marks, drive a whole fleet of trucks. So one person could manage 20 trucks through the operating system on their laptop. That's the future of automation. What does that do for the rest of the kids who maybe don't come from, a wealthy background and didn't get an opportunity to take those classes that would give them that great paying job where they can manage a fleet of 20 trucks? What happens to those kids, JP?
Well, I'd say go and watch Globotics if you have not, but in the immediate sense, we're going to look at haptic technology, meaning that you're controlling robots in another place.
Oh, but
what I'm trying to say is these will all be digital platform service jobs. You will be cleaning toilets remotely. You will be stocking shelves remotely.
Right.
You will be doing, mundane work remotely.
Right. So the good digital jobs will be available for, certain people in a certain class. This is why our platform always focuses on class war. The other digital jobs will be menial, like, I gotta control this robot to go clean these few hotel rooms, that kind of thing, So...
And you'll have to get trained for that, too.
So we're looking at a very... and all of this, these types of jobs are, there will be a huge competitive level. So what's going to happen is, as you bid, you will have to bid on these jobs.
Right. You'll never have a permanent job ever again.
You'll never have a permanent job ever again. You won't have unions to protect you. You certainly won't get benefits. You won't get pay raises. You'll see a job that you have the qualifications for. You will apply for it, and you'll get a response that says, 10,000 other people have applied for this job as well. Put in your bid. And you say, well, what do I need to survive? I need, $30 an hour to survive. Well, what if somebody else comes along and says, I only need this job can pay me $20 an hour? This is where the idea of the so-called free market comes into play. And the free market in the libertarian sense is like a great thing because it's not controlled by government. This is where you get into the idea that you're losing your government. You're losing your government to corporations that will undermine your existence. So the free market isn't always a good thing.
It's never a good thing, I don't think.
Right.
Unless
it's done in an organic, really real way.
We here take an anti-capitalist stance, and by that we mean, the only way that you can really get a so-called free market to work is if it's a very local, understood agreement type of situation. And even then, that's not really a free market. That's an agreement between neighbors.
Right, exactly. So we're more about the autonomous, let's have conversations with our neighbors. Let's create, group dialogue, that kind of thing. We're not really into the free market. All right, so that brings us into this idea. So where do the vaccine passports or the vaccines themselves come into play with all of this? This isn't territory that we are comfortable going into, but I'll stick my pinky toe into this conversation and into this pool of vaccine stuff. First of all, there's a couple of different things going on with the vaccines. And I'd like to address what I'm seeing coming out of the some of the people in the so-called woke medical community. There are some individuals that say that in 2020, the only thing that was wrong with the world was the common cold and a mass psychosis. Our opinion on this platform, which we have shared a lot, is that people who were getting very, very sick were responding to something that was happening to their blood. They were responding to something that was happening to a toxin that was done to them on purpose. Where did this toxin come from? We believe that it came through the injection of your flu shots. Let's talk about flu shots and the mass psychosis and the mass psychological campaign of flu shots. Over the last couple of decades, the idea of flu shots, the idea of getting your yearly flu shot, has been pounded into our brains, so much so that you have now two bifurcated communities. You have a bifurcated community. One side is pro-vaccine and pro-shot, and the other side is skeptical that these are actual shots, that they're full of adjuvants, they're full of toxins, aluminum, all of these things that we've come to discover. So you have this bifurcation, right? So they introduce the COVID, they introduce a sickness into the communities on purpose through the flu shot. Some of the people got really, really sick, and they called it SARS-CoV-2. Some people didn't. In wealthier communities like San Francisco, I notice that those people who are against COVID protocols, who are kind of on the right side of history, have said this is strictly 100,000% a psychological campaign because I'm not seeing evidence of anyone getting sick. Well, that's good for you, but there are certain populations that in early 2020, they were getting sick. They were suffering from something like, collapsing of their lungs, air sickness, blood, their blood was really toxic. And so it was those people who were sick that the establishment, the media, your health leaders, your health secretaries, they called that a virus when it actually wasn't. What it was a poisoning. So the population was poisoned. A small portion of the population was poisoned on purpose, enough to make people go, wow, I don't want to get that virus. I don't want to get sick. What do I need to do to not get sick? And the public health people and your leaders said, oh, I'm so glad you asked. Here's what you need to do so you don't get this terrible, mysterious virus. You need to stop going to school, stop going to work. And then a few weeks after that, they said, you know what? You might want to put on a mask, too, so you don't get this virus. And then a year after that, they said, oh, and guess what? We have a vaccine to help you not get this virus, or at least not spread it. And that vaccine, of course, is another toxin. So this is taken out of another situation that took place in the 1980s called the AIDS crisis, where a poison was introduced to a population, and that population got very sick, and the doctor said, oh, you have a virus that's called HIV, and you know what? HIV leads to AIDS. You better take these drugs in order to not get AIDS. And those drugs are what killed off a big portion of that population.
Those drugs were AIDS.
Just like the COVID shots, which are another toxin, are destroying people's lives, killing people off, and making people very, very sick for the rest of their lives. We've all discovered this. So I wanted to really drive this home, that on this platform, we do believe that in March of 2020, people were getting sick. That's what we believe. But what were they getting sick from? They were getting sick from a poison that was purposefully put into their lives. Now, how could you target very specifically a population with a poison? If you do it through the water system, it would be total chaos. So you can't do it that way. You don't want, at this point, you don't want to like destroy the entire world. If you do it through water systems, that's bad. What about spraying it in the air? Well, the toxins that they currently spray in the air, which they have been spraying in the air over time, have caused sickness over time. But those toxins, they dissipate somewhat and they get into our soil. And over time, we've seen a change in our health as a result of those toxins. But the goal was to get people really sick, really fast, with something really intense and very focused. So how do you do that? Well, you do that through a system that's already in place called vaccines that are already in place, like your flu shot. Like we've said time and again on this platform, there are people in the world who simply follow orders. They go pick up their kids from soccer practice, they go get their flu shot, they go pick up their dry cleaning, they go pick up the roasted chicken for dinner, they sit down with the family, and have dinner at night, they do their homework, they don't even think about it. It's part of their existence is to just go get a flu shot. It's what you do every year. So that's the population that was somewhat targeted. And then, of course, they pared it down even more, and they said, which populations do we want to make really, really sick? Which ones do we want to kill off? And I think it's based on demographics. It's based on how much money those people make and what they contribute to society. So we did have a sickness. It was a sickness in March of 2020. No one is denying that on this platform. But what was the sickness? It was a targeted, focused, trackable poison. That's what it was. That's what we believe. That's what we believe. So let's move forward into where we are now. And we might do a video essay about this particular subject matter that I'm about ready to bring up. But it has to do with what the Denver mayor said about opening up the city of Denver. I like using him as an example because he used very specific wording that clearly came from a script. And he made it easy for me to say, this is what he's doing. He said, February 4th, the public health order will be terminated. That's the word I was looking for earlier. It will be stopped, voided, terminated.
Okay.
The public health order will be terminated. You do not have to wear a mask, and you don't have to show proof of a vaccine anymore, except for schools and vulnerable populations. And vulnerable populations is what you use to describe nursing homes, elder care facilities, hospitals, any place where they provide care for the elderly or the disabled. So everybody else in the world gets to be normal. Everybody else who's considered healthy and is considered, great, they all get to be, and considered a contributing part of society, they all get freedom. But those people who are deemed burdens on society, like the elderly who need care, or the disabled community that needs care, or children who need care, those people don't get freedom. That's what you get with something called the Barrington Declaration. The Barrington Declaration uses a term that when I first heard the Declaration trending, it was, I forget what it was. It must have been about a year ago now, that everybody was talking about how great the Barrington Declaration was because it opened things back up, and you had all of these, scientists and doctors and economists who were signing on to the Barrington Declaration to support it. But there was a term in there that gave me the chills, and it's called focused protection. Focused protection is where you can take an entire population, you take an entire global population, and you say, you are now a targeted, vulnerable population. We have to lock you down. We have to put you in a mask. We have to make sure that you have your vaccines. We have to take away your freedom and your life. And we have to put you into systems that will actually hurt you and cause you pain. Unfortunately, the Barrington Declaration uses the term focused protection as cover for these goals. My concern is that the Barrington Declaration will be used as a document, will be used as a platform in order to put something that is right now just an idea that they are using as a way, as sort of a hopium in front of people. Oh, look, you get freedom, look at that. And dangle it in front of people's faces, that they're going to use it as a way to change actual policy, which is where it gets really scary. Remember what I said. Right now, there are no laws. There are no ordinance in place that would support these mask policies or these vaccine passport policies. There's nothing in place. You can go to your school district and you can say, there's no law here which requires my child to wear a mask, so they're not wearing a mask. You can do that. My concern is that with the language that's coming out of the Barrington Declaration, which is focused protection, is that it targets communities that they would say and attribute to being vulnerable. So this is random. This means that you can randomly choose a community and say, oh, guess what? You have a spike in COVID cases. It's time for you to shut down. Whereas the community right next to you is wide open. With the Barrington Declaration, it's like whack-a-mole. That's what it feels like to me. Like whack-a-mole across the country. So I am not supportive of the Barrington Declaration for that reason, because on this platform, we think long game. Most of what we assimilate and most of what we talk about has come true. If you look back at those 4 video essays that we did prior to the age of COVID, let's go backwards. Folie à deux, which again is the shared psychosis of a population. Then you go back to theft of the commons, which is the suspension of current laws and rules that are in place in order to allow the corporations to gobble up what's rightfully yours, whether it's land or your freedom of movement. Which takes us to a video essay we did called Restriction of Movement, which our movement was restricted, wasn't it, when we were told to so-called lock down. And then the other video essay we did, which is called Expulsion, which is the erasure of history to remind us who we are, which we can easily attribute to wearing the mask, reminding us that we're not human, erasing the most human aspect of our entire bodies, which is our face, which is very expressive. So all of those 4 video essays are a window into what we're experiencing now. And I'd like to move forward and explain that impact investments, corporations that have invested in behavioral modification, is where the future lies. I have multiple conversations with, excuse me, with mothers in the neighborhood I currently live in. and I will ask them, how's your kid doing in school? And this is their response. The teacher says that he's behaving really well. Well, what is he learning? Is he learning anything? What do you mean? He's passing. He's getting his badges. But what is he learning? Is he learning anything? He's doing good. He got the gold star. He got the badges. He got the nudging. He's doing really good. While he's wearing a mask and on his tablet. And he's basically playing games all day to get to the next level. The curriculum is now reframed into gaming. He's learning about theories that are warped and obfuscate the truth about our history and where and who we are and what we are as a country. He's learning about culture wars instead of class war. He is also being trained on a very, low level, because this is a neighborhood of poverty, so they don't have the automation curriculum for these kids. These kids, there's no tax bracket here in this neighborhood, so these kids get the bare minimum. What about his band that he was involved in? Oh, well, they did away with band. There's no more band. He doesn't have to go to band practice anymore. Oh, okay. Well, what about the football team? I heard they were doing really well. Oh, well, they don't do the football team anymore either. They closed off the field because of COVID. You see? Robots and people who don't understand who they are, they don't need to play music. They don't need to play on sports teams. So we're really changing. We're really putting a lot of money and a lot of investment into the behavior of the future generation. And, there are plenty of parents that are fighting this. They have yanked their kids out of the wrong schools and put them in the right schools, which don't make the kids wear a mask and still teach them a curriculum that would promote critical thinking, which is good. And they actually teach them the real history of, the world and life, and teach them all the things that we were taught in school. And then there are some people that have just taken their kids out of the school system entirely, and they are homeschooling, which I'm a big advocate for at this point. Now that I've learned over the last year the amount of money and investment that's going into impacting the changes in the future generation's behavior, I'm a huge advocate for getting them out of that altogether. Who's benefiting from all of this? Well, those people who write the code, those people who put in the automation, those people who even are investing in the psychological aspect of this, they're benefiting from a lot of this. So I wanted to bring you up to speed and take you through the ages, which is in the Book of Hours, through the ages, that's like 3 years. I wanted to just take you through and tell you exactly where we stood on everything, because if it's not clear and it's not transparent, then you will always be confused. And I would also like to remind you that just because you don't see evidence of a 2020 illness in your area, which probably is privileged, that doesn't mean that it didn't happen. Lots of people were getting sick in 2020 from a poison, and then we were told it was a virus. And in order for that virus to keep you from getting the disease, COVID-19, you had to take another poison. This is how it goes. That is what we believe to be the absolute truth about the nature of the health aspect of this. There is all sorts of layers of the economic aspect to this. I haven't even touched on the central bank takeovers of of your governments, because I believe that it's a corporate takeover of the government, and they're destroying all of your legacy institutions, which would give you an understanding of where your community and where your country or your state comes from, the history, that you learned in school. I grew up in California, so I learned about the gold rush and the history of California and how California came into being. In my school, when I was in school. So the last part of this that I want to also talk about is a video essay that we did called Deconstruction. So deconstruction is, it does go back to what I talked about, how you are losing federal oversight. You are losing that layer of your institutional democracy. So your life is now ruled by a global governance, which is capitalist in nature. Corporations, companies, big tech, big pharma, big medical, globally have, all of their pieces in place. And then they will then send their people out to your regions. And your regions are clumps of states that are working together. I live in the Eastern States Multi-Council region, which includes 7 states: Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. This is one shared bureaucracy, one shared economy, and one sort of shared ideology, okay? I'm in this one region, which is a clump of 7 states, or what they call interstate compacts. Not every state in the United States is in an interstate compact. Not everyone. So you take a global initiative and you then go to your region and you say to the whole region, you have to follow these policies, these economic policies, these social movement policies, these behavioral modification policies, these health policies. You have to follow all these policies. And then your region will then tell your local people, your municipal leaders, your school board people, and say, here's the money to impact these global policies. I hope that makes sense. The question you have to ask yourself is always, who benefits? And then the second question you have to ask yourself is, well, where's my individual voice in this whole process? Where's my voice? Well, they claim that your voice is through voting. And yet, you've been voting all these years, and look what happened. You lost all your rights. You lost your money. Your children are being abused. You've got something called the Barrington Declaration, which is going to target communities at will whenever they feel like it, under the guise of, quote, focused protection. Does that sound like a democracy that you would vote for? So you have to, and we don't even, on this platform, we know that it's false, so we don't even go there. We're not even registered to vote, and we never will be. So you have to ask yourself, where is my voice in this entire thing? Where is it? It's nowhere, is it? You've been muted. You've been erased. You only exist to make those corporations wealthy, to make them influential in your governments. So how do you operate in this entire system? You have to do you have to make an individual stand. The individual stand is, you have to know who you are. You have to know what you want. A lot of people don't, in the United States especially. They don't know who they are. They don't know what they want. They base their identity on what the community or what the media or what their school or their church has told them what they are. So I think what we need is, some shadow work going on in each individual. Who are you? What do you love? What makes you happy? What brings you joy outside of what you are told brings you joy? And then you have to decide. If you don't like wearing a mask, then you avoid every single place on the planet that requires you to. I no longer go to doctor's appointments for my autoimmune illness. I no longer do anything because they require a mask. If they require part of it. So you have to make an individual decision for yourself. And if each individual makes those individual decisions for themselves, and they may not align with, your neighbor's choices, they may not even align with people in your family, but if each individual does what individually works for them, the system will be starved. That's almost a given. So, I think that's what we have to count on, is this individual decision to think critically, to make decisions about what they want to do to their own body, to make decisions about how they want to earn an income and where they want their money to go. And last but not least, we do have, although we did have, a toxin that was released, a targeted, focused poison that was released on the population in 2020, we also have a mass psychological manipulation campaign, and we see that through the trucker convoy, where people are donating their hard-earned money into something that's ultimately going to hurt them in the long run. And we've talked about this. Our very latest episode of Bookmark, we went through all of it, and we showed you the Uber Freight headlines, and we showed you, we tried to help you understand that jobs will be lost to automation, and what the future holds for one of the last jobs that are available in the United States that still pay very well and have, good, strong unions behind them and have good benefits. And you don't have to be like Ivy League to have that job. And you could still support a family with that job. You could still, earn a good income with that job. And that's truck driving. That's going away. So this whole truck convoy thing is a message to you that says, all it tells me is that all these jobs are going away. And even though they're using the cover of end the mask mandates now, they're using that as a signal, as a cover. We believe that mask mandates and vaccine mandates, they say end the vaccine mandates now is what they're saying, is what they're, putting on the sides of their trucks and everything. We're supportive of that, of course. But we believe that vaccine passports and vaccine mandates and mask mandates and all this stuff, we believe that's going to end anyway. It would end anyway throughout your countries, throughout your cities, your local governments. It's going to end anyway. But that doesn't mean that they won't, that, individually, like when you walk into a place, they'll say, where's your mask? It's like, well, you guys ended the mask mandate. And the person, behind the counter might say, oh, well, our store policy is that you have to wear a mask. Well, then you just leave. You don't give them your business. So even though you might have leadership coming out and saying, it's over, yay, it's going to be based on individual store policy and individual business policy. Just keeping in mind that each and every business, like I mentioned before in this audio, each and every business that enforces a store policy is not supported by law. There are already laws in place in the United States, and those laws are backed up with ordinance numbers, and those laws are public accommodation laws, and there's a number attached to that. So you can, resist it by saying, oh, well, you're breaking the law. You're breaking the law. and leave. And just say, you do know that you're breaking an already existing law. Store policy, you are not governed by store policy. You are not governed by your vaccine status. You are not governed by impact investors that want you to change your behavior. You are not governed by a mask. You are not governed by your teacher. You are not governed by your school district. You are not governed by guilt, shame, hope, peer pressure, your screens, your social media posts. You are governed in your local communities. You are governed by law, but even more so, you are governed by yourself. You are self-governing, all right? You have all the power over yourself. You can choose to live your life any way you want, as long as you're not hurting people. And that's really all there is to it. A complicated situation full of lots and lots of voices. A giant, confusing, rattling of voices has caused a lot of us to forget who we are and what we're here for. We're here to live the best life. We're here to connect. We are here to carve out something new out of the old. We've forgotten that, and we need to get back to it. So I thought I would take you through the ages, express to you what we feel is happening, and we hope that you've enjoyed this audio and that you got something out of it. Thank you.